When the Byzantine emperor appealed to the West for aid against the Seljuk Turks, he triggered a movement far larger than he intended. Pope Urban II responded not with troops, but with a call for holy war, a crusade vowed by knights, peasants, and lords alike. Among them was Bohemond of Tarrant, ambitious and landless, driven as much by personal fortune as by faith. As this undisciplined host crossed into Anatolia, it clashed bitterly with Turkish raiders near Dorylaeum. Ahead lay famine, betrayal, and the siege of a sacred city, long thought unreachable. In the autumn of 1095, Emperor Alexios I Komnenos dispatched envoys from Constantinople, bearing a sealed plea to the courts of the West. His empire, though resurgent, faced relentless pressure from Seljuk Turkish advances in Anatolia. He requested seasoned knights, professional soldiers bound by contract, to reinforce his thinning imperial armies. Anna Komnene later wrote that her father sought not pilgrims but swords for hire. He envisioned disciplined companies arriving by sea, swearing temporary allegiance to the purple banner of Byzantium. Yet in the West, his appeal fell on fertile and fervent ground. At the Council of Clermont in November, beneath vaulted arches, and the crackle of torchlight, Pope Urban II reshaped the emperor's narrow request into a divine summons. He called not for mercenaries but for a holy army to liberate Jerusalem itself. William of Tyre records how the cry "Deus vult," God wills it, swept the crowd like fire. What Alexios intended as a military transaction, Urban transformed into a spiritual revolution. The Pope offered more than glory. He promised plenary indulgence, the remission of sins, a spiritual guarantee that drew not only knights but masses. Bishops read aloud his decree in cathedrals from Normandy to Lombardy. Soon tens of thousands took the cross, some stitching cloth crucifix to tunics, others brandishing newly forged blades. Sources estimate between 60 and 100 would eventually march east, a scale Alexios never imagined. By early 1096, waves of response began rolling east, not only knights, but peasants, preachers, and zealots, all marked with the cross. They came not in imperial galleys, but in disorganized columns driven by faith, ambition, or despair. Alexios, watching from the Theodosian walls, saw not the reinforcement he had bargained for, but a tide of unpredictable fervor. He had asked for a shield, the West sent a storm. Now he faced a new dread: how to feed, control, and channel this zeal without being swept away by it. Across France, the Rhineland, and Italy, the call to crusade ignited a movement of unprecedented scale. Knights swore oaths upon relics, peasants loaded meager possessions into creaking wagons, and bishops thundered from pulpits about a sacred war to reclaim Jerusalem. Many sewed crosses of cloth onto their tunics, the signum crucis that marked them as Milit's Christi, soldiers of Christ bound by sacred vow. By the spring of 1096, a great and varied multitude, some well-armed, many more helplessly unprepared, had gathered under banners bearing the cross. They began their march east toward Constantinople, an unstoppable tide of faith and fervor. Among them moved the ragged host known as the People's Crusade, led by the fiery preacher Peter, the hermit, zealous, ill-disciplined, and tragically under-equipped for the trials ahead. Anna Komnene writes of the astonishment in Constantinople as these Westerners arrived, not the regiments of mercenaries her father expected, but a throng of fervent pilgrims and would-be warriors. Wagons groaned under the weight of hope, pilgrims sang hymns in unfamiliar tongues. Some carried fragments of saints, bones believing divine favor would shield them from Seljuk arrows. Others brought farming tools, expecting to till the soil of paradise. By early summer, some 60 souls pressed toward the mighty walls of the Byzantine capital, alarming an empire already wary of this uncontrolled surge of Latin devotion. Imperial scouts reported bands of 20 or more crossing the Danube, living off the land and clashing with local garrisons. And still they came, a river of belief and desperation flowing inexorably toward a world they did not understand and dangers for which they were wholly unprepared. They did not know that the arid plains of Anatolia lay ahead where water was scarce and Turkish horse archers waited. In late summer 1096, the ragged host known as the People's Crusade pushed east from Constantinople into Anatolia. Emperor Alexios had urged them to wait for the main armies of knights and nobles, but zeal and impatience drove them onward. They were poorly armed, undisciplined, and led by preachers, not soldiers. William of Tyre later wrote that they moved like sheep without a shepherd. Many clutched fragments of the true cross or sewn on pilgrim badges, believing divine favor would shield them from harm. Ignoring Byzantine advice and local guides, they entered the territory of Kilij Arslan, the Seljuk Sultan of Rum. They had no supply lines, no clear objective, and no unified command. Hunger and thirst quickly set in. Some broke away to raid nearby settlements, drawing the Sultan's attention. By October, the main body camped near Sivtat, a coastal fortress, unaware that Turkish scouts watched their every move. Anakamni noted their campfires glowed like false stars in a profane sky. At dawn, Ghazi raiders, light cavalry dedicated to holy war, swept into the Crusader camp. Panic spread as tents burned and unarmed pilgrims were cut down. Those who tried to form ranks were surrounded and overwhelmed. Anakamnin records the scale of the slaughter. Nearly all of the 20 pilgrims and zealots were killed or captured. Only a handful, including Peter the Hermit, escaped back to Byzantine lands. The air filled with the screams of the dying and the triumphant cries of Turkish archers. The sun rose over a field littered with crosses and corpses. The Turks left the dead unburied, a grim warning to any who would follow. This was not a battle but a massacre, a lesson in the harsh realities of holy war. Faith alone could not shield an army from arrows and horsemen. News of the disaster raced west, shocking those still preparing to take the cross. It was a brutal awakening. The road to Jerusalem would be paved with more than prayer. And even as the princes and knights of the main crusade gathered at Constantinople, the shadow of Sivtat hung over them, a reminder that faith without steel and zeal without order led only to annihilation. Kilij Arslan, now confident and contemptuous, would soon turn his seasoned army toward the next wave of invaders. By late autumn of 1096, the main armies of the Princes' Crusade began assembling outside the formidable walls of Constantinople. They came not as a unified host, but as regional contingents, Normans from southern Italy under Bohemond of Taranto, Provençals, led by the pious Raymond IV of Toulouse, and Lorrainers commanded by Godfrey of Bouillon. Their banners, heavy with regional pride and sacred purpose, fluttered above camps spread along the Golden Horn. Emperor Alexios I Komnenos watched their arrival with deep unease. He had asked the West for mercenaries, not this swelling tide of armed pilgrims and ambitious lords. Now he faced a force larger than his own imperial army camped at his very gates. Alexios moved swiftly to impose order. He demanded that each Crusader leader swear an oath of loyalty to him, acknowledging Byzantine sovereignty over any former imperial lands they might recapture. To men who saw themselves as free lords answering God's call, this was a bitter pill. Bohemond, ever the pragmatist, swore with calculating ease. Godfrey resisted at first, but after imperial supplies were withheld, he too relented. Raymond alone offered a modified oath, refusing to become the emperor's liege man, but pledging not to dishonor him. William of Tyre later notes that these oaths were given more from necessity than willing heart. By early 1097, the grudging agreements were sealed, and the Crusaders began crossing the Bosporus into Asia Minor. They entered a land scarred by recent war and Seljuk dominance. Imperial guides accompanied them, and Byzantine ships shadowed the coast, but the real test lay inland. The Crusaders now numbered perhaps 30,000 to 40,000 fighting men, including some 550 knights plus non-combatants. They marched not as one army, but as a coalition of rival commands, each leader jealously guarding his authority and his men's loyalty. Anatolia observed that her father watched them depart with foreboding, seeing in their fervor both hope and hazard. As the last knights disembarked onto the Asian shore, the clatter of hooves and creak of saddles filled the air, a sound of coming collision. They faced not only Turkish arrows and scorching plains, but the specter of their own fraying unity. The true crusade was only beginning, and already the wind carried whispers of betrayal and thirst. In early July 1097, the Crusader host left the captured city of Nicaea and marched southeast into the Anatolian interior. They moved in two divisions separated by a few hours' march, a precaution, but one that invited disaster. On the morning of July 1, near the ruined Byzantine town of Dorylaeum, the vanguard under Godfrey of Bouillon and Bohemond's nephew Tancred was struck without warning. From the surrounding hills, Kilij Arslan's Turkish cavalry descended in waves, loosing clouds of arrows. The Latin knights trained for close combat found themselves encircled and harried by fast-moving horse archers they could not reach. William of Tyre writes that the Turks came on like a river in flood. For hours the Crusaders held a desperate perimeter, shields locked, horses falling around them. The heat was brutal, dust choked the air. Non-combatants huddled at the center, praying as arrows fell among them. Some clutched reliquaries or fragments of the true cross, hoping divine favor might spare them from the storm of missiles. Anatolia later wrote that the Franks fought like men possessed, their banners, the vexillum sanctum of the cross, waving above the fray even as men fell beneath them. Bohemond, riding with the 2nd Division, heard the distant din of battle and pushed his forces forward at a forced march. Trumpets sounded the advance, the thunder of hooves echoed across the plain as his knights rode toward the sound of combat. By midday, the main Crusader army arrived. Knights under Raymond of Toulouse and Robert of Normandy hitting the Turkish rear, just as Godfrey's men rallied and charged from within. Caught between two fronts, Kilij Arslan's army broke and scattered. The sudden reversal was as much psychological as tactical. The Turks, who had believed the Franks already broken, now found themselves outmaneuvered and outfought. The victory was decisive but costly. Sources estimate between 40 and 50 Turkish riders fell against hundreds of Crusader losses. More than raw courage, it was coordination and timing that saved the Latin host, a lesson not lost on the commanders. Yet as the dust settled and the wounded were tended, a starker reality set in. They were deep in enemy territory, far from supply, with the long road to Antioch still ahead. The real battle now was not against Turkish arrows, but against the sun-scorched earth itself. Ahead lay the waterless plains of Phrygia, where thirst and heat would claim more lives than any ambush. Victory at Dorylaeum in July 1097 opened the road east, but the land itself now rose against the Crusaders. They marched into the heart of Anatolia, a sun-scorched plateau stripped of food and water. Turkish riders shadowed their flanks, launching swift attacks before melting back into the hills. Wells were poisoned or filled. Men and horses collapsed from thirst, their tongues swelling in the relentless heat. William of Tyre later wrote that the Turks had wasted the land ahead of them, leaving nothing for the invaders to live on. Commanders like Bohemond and Raymond urged discipline, but desperation set in. Knights discarded their armor, pilgrims abandoned precious relics by the roadside. The stench of dead animals fouled the air. At times nobles wept openly at the sight of their followers suffering, a rare crack in the stern facade of feudal pride. Morale frayed with every empty horizon. 1 in 10, perhaps more, would not complete the crossing. Some among the host began to see signs in the sky, portents of divine wrath or deliverance. Dust devils whirled like spirits across the cracked earth. A rumor spread of a spring struck from rock by a desperate knight's lance, a fleeting miracle that saved 100 but mocked thousands. Fulcher of Chartres wrote of men drinking blood from their horses or lying delirious in the shade of their own shields. The very banners of the crusade, the vexillum sancti, Petri, the cross of Toulouse, hung limp in the windless heat, symbols of a vow that now felt like a sentence. By late autumn, the survivors stumbled into the green valleys of Cilicia, a sudden reprieve of orchards and flowing streams. But the cost was staggering. Thousands had perished from thirst, heatstroke, or Turkish arrows. Some sources suggest as many as 1 in 5 were lost in that terrible transit. The army that regrouped on the plains was leaner, hardened, and acutely aware of its fragility. They had crossed a wasteland, but ahead lay Antioch, a city of immense walls, divided loyalties, and greater peril still. In October 1097, the armies of the First Crusade stood before Antioch, a city of immense walls and towers guarding the fertile plains and mountain passes that led south toward Jerusalem. It was the most formidable urban fortress any of them had ever seen, defended by the Seljuk Emir Yaghisian, and a garrison strengthened by years of preparation. Direct assault was impossible. Instead, the crusading princes made a fateful choice. They would encircle the city, cutting its supply routes and waiting for starvation or betrayal to open its gates. They established separate camps around Antioch's land walls, each led by a different commander. But this division was not only tactical, it was personal. Bohemond of Taranto, shrewd and ambitious, saw in Antioch a prize he intended to keep for himself. Raymond of Toulouse, devout and stubborn, resisted such ambitions, insisting all conquests be held in common or returned to the Byzantine emperor as they had sworn. William of Tyre later wrote that discord grew among the princes like a poison. As weeks turned to months, the siege became a test of endurance. Supply lines thinned, foraging parties brought back less and less. By December, hunger stalked the camps. Horses were slaughtered. Men gnawed on leather and roots. Frost lined the tents each morning, and the mud of the Orontes Valley clung to everything. Through that grim winter, the Crusaders held on, but barely. Desertions mounted. Some slipped away under cover of night, others attempted to flee openly and were brought back in shame. Yaghisian's troops launched sallies from the city's gates, testing the Latin lines. Still, the blockade held. Inside Antioch, supplies also dwindled. The emir expelled Christians he deemed untrustworthy, and refugees streamed into the Crusader camps, adding to the strain. By early 1098, both besiegers and besieged were living on the edge of collapse. Priests moved among the shivering ranks, raising crosses and chanting psalms to fortify morale. The sound of hammers echoed as engineers built mangonels and siege towers, wooden giants rising slowly against stone. Yet faith warred with despair. Some soldiers claimed to see omens in the flight of birds or the shape of clouds. Others simply stared at the high walls, knowing that perhaps 1 in 3 would not see spring. Yet the greatest danger was not starvation or the enemy. It was ambition. Bohemond quietly began negotiating with a tower commander inside the city, a man said to be disaffected. He offered the other princes a deal: if he could secure the city's surrender, Antioch would be his. Raymond refused, and distrust festered. The crusade, born of shared faith and sworn oaths, now hung on a knife's edge. Its leaders divided its soldiers, starving its purpose, clouded by rivalry. And beyond the mountains, a new threat gathered. Kerbogha Adebig of Mosul was marching west with a great army intent on crushing the invaders and lifting the siege. On the night of June 3, 1098, a small postern gate in Antioch's walls swung open. Bohemond of Taranto and his men slipped inside, guided by an Armenian guard named Firuz, who had been bribed or persuaded to betray his city. The Crusaders, starved and desperate after 8 months of siege, flooded into the streets. Panic spread among the Turkish garrison. By dawn, the city was theirs, but so too was the stench of death and decay. They had taken Antioch, but they could not eat its stones. Within days, a new shadow fell across the land. Kerbogha Adebig of Mosul arrived with a vast relief army. Sources estimate between 30,000 and 40,000 troops. The Crusaders, perhaps 15,000 remaining, now found themselves trapped inside the city they had just captured. Their own siege became a prison. Starvation tightened its grip. Horses were eaten, then rats, then leather. Desertions mounted. William of Tyre records a night of mass panic when knights tried to flee over the walls. Morale collapsed. Then came a vision. A peasant named Peter Bartholomew claimed St. Andrew had shown him where the Holy Lance, the very spear that pierced Christ's side, lay buried. In a tense public spectacle, he dug beneath the floor of Antioch's cathedral. When an iron point emerged, the army erupted in cries of joy and renewed faith. Adhemer of Lepi, the papal legate, was skeptical, but the timing was divine. Hope returned like a sudden rain in the desert. Raymond of Aguilars wrote that men who had moments before despaired now swore to fight in the name of God and the lance. Banners that had hung limp were raised again. Priests moved through the ranks offering absolutions. The very air seemed charged, not with fear but with a desperate, fervent certainty. Yet belief alone could not break the siege. Kerbogha's army still encircled them 10-to-1 in number. The Crusaders now faced a choice: starve behind walls or march out and dare a miracle. Their decision would turn not on strategy but on something far older, the conviction that heaven had chosen them. And so, gaunt and desperate, they prepared to charge into the mouth of the lion. On the morning of June 28, 1098, the Crusaders marched from the gates of Antioch, a gaunt and desperate army. They were starving, reduced by months of siege, but now driven by a fierce and desperate faith. The discovery of what was believed to be the Holy Lance had transformed their despair into a conviction of divine favor. They advanced across the plain toward the Orontes River, where the vast army of Kerbogha Adebig of Mosul stood waiting. Sources vary from 30-0 to 75-0, strong, a host drawn from across Mesopotamia and Syria. Bohemond of Taranto, the shrewd and ambitious Norman commander, organized the army into divisions, placing himself at the vanguard and Raymond of Toulouse at the center. They moved forward under a searing sun, their tattered banners and sun-bleached crosses a stark contrast to the glittering ranks of Turkish horsemen. The initial Seljuk cavalry charges were met with a disciplined wall of shields and spears. The chronicler Raymond of Aguilars, who was present, claims the Crusaders fought with a supernatural endurance, their belief making them impervious to fatigue. Trumpets blared across the field, dust rose in thick clouds, choking men and horses alike. The real weakness, however, lay not in Frankish zeal, but in Kerbogha's coalition. His army was a fragile alliance of emirs and regional commanders, each with their own ambitions and suspicions. As the Frankish pressure mounted, this alliance began to fracture. A crucial contingent of Turkish horse suddenly withdrew from the field, perhaps believing the battle lost or seeking to preserve its own strength. This triggered a cascade of panic. The Seljuk line wavered, then broke entirely as men turned their horses and fled. The Crusaders, sensing the miracle they had prayed for, surged forward into the rout. The field was won not by overwhelming force, but by the collapse of their enemy's will. In the aftermath, the Crusaders scavenged Kerbogha's abandoned camp, finding food, gold, and weapons that ended their immediate starvation. Yet the victory sowed the seeds of a deeper conflict. Bohemond, who had masterminded the capture of Antioch, now moved to claim the city for himself. He refused to honor the oath he and the other princes had sworn to Emperor Alexios to return any former Byzantine territories. This act of defiance transformed a temporary rivalry into a permanent schism between the Latin Crusaders and the Greek Empire. The Franks now held Antioch, but they held it in bad faith, with a betrayed and furious Byzantine emperor to their rear, and the long road to Jerusalem still ahead. Nearly a year had passed since the miraculous victory at Antioch, a year consumed by hunger, rivalry, and hesitation. The Crusader princes, Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, and Tancred, remained divided by ambition and grievance. But in January 1099, they finally turned south toward the object of all their vows, Jerusalem. Their force now numbered fewer than 12-0, a threadbare remnant of the great armies that had crossed into Anatolia. Among these, perhaps only 200 remained fully armored knights. They marched into the Holy Land not as conquerors but as survivors. The landscape itself became their adversary. They moved through the sun-scorched wadis and limestone hills of the southern Levant, a country of sharp angles and little water. Supplies ran desperately low. Men and horses suffered under a pitiless sky. William of Tyre later noted the profound exhaustion that gripped the host, a weariness of both body and spirit. Yet they pressed on, driven by a final fervent purpose. Some clutched relics or fragments of the true cross, their faith a shield against despair. The wind carried dust and the scent of dry thyme, a bitter perfume for a march of bones. Ahead lay a transformed political reality. Jerusalem was no longer held by the Seljuk Turks they had fought for years, but by the Shia Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt. The Fatimids had recaptured the holy city only months before, and now watched the Latin advance with calculating eyes. Their governor Iftikhar al-Dawla fortified Jerusalem's walls and expelled its Christian inhabitants, bracing for a siege. From Cairo, the vizier Alafdal Shahanshah began assembling a relief army, confident his professional soldiers would easily break these exhausted invaders. Raymond of Aguilars wrote of rumors spreading through the camp, whispers of walls too high, wells too deep, defenders too many. The Crusaders knew none of this in detail, only that a new power stood between them and Zion. Their unity, fragile as it was now, became their final weapon. They were fewer, hungrier, and more exposed than at any point in the long march from Constantinople. But they were also closer than any army from the west had been in centuries. And ahead, gleaming on the horizon, waited the walls of Jerusalem, and behind them the gathering storm of Egypt. Already scouts brought word of Fatimid patrols shadowing their advance. The final test was near. In June 1099, the weary remnants of the First Crusade finally looked upon the walls of Jerusalem. But their triumph felt hollow. They were too few, perhaps only 12,000 remained, and they had no timber for siege engines. The Fatimid garrison watched from above, confident behind massive walls. For weeks, the Latins circled the holy city, fasting and praying, while foraging parties scoured the barren hills for wood. Priests carried relics before the ranks, and voices rose in the Vexilla Regis, hymns mingling with the dry wind. Then a miracle, ships from Genoa arrived at Jaffa carrying nails, ropes, and most crucially timber. The Crusaders labored day and night, dragging beams across rocky ground. Soon 2 great siege towers began to rise, wooden giants on wheels taller than the walls, like churches built for war. From the ramparts, defenders hurled jars of Greek fire, and the smell of smoke and pitch clung to the air. On the night of July 13, the final assault began. Godfrey of Bouillon's tower inched toward the northern wall, while Raymond of Toulouse's advanced from the south. Arrows and Greek fire rained down the air, filled with smoke and screams. Men clambered up ladders under a hail of stones, some falling silently, others crying out to saints. Raymond of Aguilars wrote that they fought with the wrath of God in their eyes. For a full day the defenders held. Then at midday on the 15th, Godfrey's men flung firebrands over the ramparts, driving back the guards. A knight from Tournai clambered onto the wall, then more. The drawbridge crashed down. Crusaders poured into the city, their banners, the cross and the lion, rising above the chaos. What followed was not battle but slaughter. Combatants and civilians alike fell in a storm of vengeance and religious fury. Jerusalem was taken, but even in victory the cost was staggering. Thousands lay dead in the streets and mosques. Chroniclers estimated between 10 and 40,000 perished in the sack. The Crusaders had fulfilled their vow, yet now faced a greater test holding the city. Word soon came that a Fatimid army was marching from Egypt. Godfrey, newly named defender of the Holy Sepulchre, prepared his exhausted men for one more fight. The Holy War was over. The struggle for survival had just begun. The dust of the road had scarcely settled when the question of rule over Jerusalem arose. Who could claim a crown in the city where Christ had worn thorns? Raymond of Toulouse offered kingship, first refused with a show of piety that masked political caution. Some whispered he hoped others would refuse first, leaving him the only credible candidate. Bohemond was already entrenched in Antioch, his ambitions sated in the north, his gaze fixed on expanding his principality rather than a distant throne. So the lords turned to Godfrey of Bouillon, who accepted authority, but not the title of king. He took instead the humble style Advocatus Sancti Sepulchri, defender of the Holy Sepulchre, a crownless ruler for a kingdom only just born. Yet even as processions wound through streets still stained with battle, news came from the south. A Fatimid army, thousands strong, some chroniclers say 20, others nearer 30, was marching from Egypt under the vizier Alafdal. They meant to reclaim what the Franks had just seized, confident after recent victories against Seljuk rivals. Godfrey had little time. He gathered every knight and foot soldier who could still hold a weapon, perhaps fewer than 5,000 in all, many weakened by wounds and months of hunger. They marched south toward Ascalon, driven by faith and desperation. Raymond of Aguilers claims the army carried with them the relic of the Holy Lance, a symbol of divine favor in the face of impossible odds. Banners bearing the cross fluttered above columns of weary men, their eyes scanning the dry hills for the first sign of the enemy. The Crusaders moved through the coastal plains under a punishing sun. The air smelled of dust and sweat. The only sounds were the creak of leather, the clank of mail, and murmured prayers. They knew another defeat would erase everything: the sacrifices at Antioch, the horrors of the siege, the blood spilled at the walls. Their survival now hinged on one final clash. As they drew near Ascalon, scouts brought word. The Fatimid host was camped nearby, unaware, overconfident, their lines not yet properly formed. Godfrey organized his weary men into a battle line, knights at the center, foot soldiers flanking. The fate of the crusade of the Holy City itself now hung by a thread over the fields of Ascalon, and the Franks knew they must win or see Jerusalem lost before they had even held it a month. On the morning of August 12, 1099, the Crusader army moved south from Jerusalem toward Ascalon. They knew an Egyptian host had gathered there, sent by the vizier Alafdal to reclaim the Holy City. Godfrey of Bouillon led the force with Raymond of Toulouse and the two Roberts, Normandy and Flanders, riding beside him. They numbered perhaps 10,000, hardened by 3 years of war, yet weary and diminished. The Fatimids camped outside Ascalon's walls were unprepared. William of Tyre later wrote that they were taken entirely by surprise. Dawn mist still clung to the coastal plain when the Frankish cavalry struck. They came from the north in tight formation, lances lowered, crashing into the Egyptian camp before proper resistance could form. Panic spread through the Muslim ranks. Arrows fell among tents and picket lines. Knights on heavy horses trampled men who had not yet armed. The vizier's army, though large, sources estimate between 10 and 20,000, was caught disorganized and off guard. Many tried to flee toward the sea or the city gates, but Ascalon's defenders, fearing the Franks would enter with them, barred the doors. Trapped between the walls and the Latin charge, the Fatimid force shattered. By mid-morning, the field belonged to the Crusaders. A coastal breeze carried the scent of salt and blood. They had captured the vizier's personal standard and vast quantities of supplies, treasure, and weapons. Alafdal himself barely escaped by sea, his galley cutting through waves littered with remnants of his host. It was a stunning victory, one that secured Jerusalem for now. Yet even in triumph, division festered. Raymond of Toulouse had attempted to negotiate the surrender of Ascalon, but the city's elders, hearing of disputes between him and Godfrey, refused to yield. The gates remained closed. The opportunity to secure the coast was lost. Most crusaders saw their vows as complete. Within months, the majority began the long journey home. Only a few hundred knights and several thousand infantry remained in the Holy Land, perhaps one knight for every mile of frontier. Godfrey, now titled Advocate of the Holy Sepulchre, ruled a kingdom surrounded by enemies, Egypt to the south, Damascus to the east, and hostile ports along the coast. The Latin East was born in victory, but stood on fragile ground. It would not be long before the drums of jihad answered from Cairo.